All right, everyone. This is Mr. Martinez. This is going to be the lesson we're going to be learning. I figure I'd start at the beginning so that we could just have a little bit of continuity. Make sure this is in focus. As I said before, I am new to all this, so hopefully it'll work out. Obviously, the goal is for you to be able to see what I've been teaching you, to supplement the book work you guys have been doing and the workbook. So your job is to take focus notes on what you see, and since you can pause it and replay it as many times as you want, I'm not going to go as slow as I normally would go, so I will go at a certain pace. So let's dig in. So you left off learning about the Middle Ages, life after Rome. And basically, as I had already taught you, sequentially this is what transpired after the fall of Rome. So, here we go. First here we have a map, and I remember showing you before the extent of the Roman Empire and what it is after the fall. You can see how much it had shrunken. You can see the various barbarians who had invaded. So we have that. And what it looked like shortly after. You can actually see the remnants of the former Roman Empire and what it looked like afterwards. So, what were the Middle Ages? First, the Middle Ages were a dark age for Europe. We learned this. It's called the Dark Ages because nothing really new was invented. It was in fact, they seem to have gone back from the very developments of the Roman Empire. All right. Near constant invasions and resources required the Europeans develop a new system for living. And what they come up with, you guys probably remember this. They came up with feudalism. Let me adjust this a little bit. I can see that you're not getting the whole thing. There we go. All right. So, it was feudalism. All right, what is feudalism, you might ask? Well, socio-political economic system that dominated all aspects of medieval life. As we learn, everything was dominated by this idea that you needed to have protection, and it came from the king to the lord to the knights to the peasants. This was all centered around the castle. A lord's castle would include peasant villages, church, farmland, and a mill. And just note that those of you who are watching this for the first time, most of this has already been written down by the students. What I'm doing now is just starting from the beginning. If I leave this up on the YouTube channel, then you can watch this at your leisure and get all the notes. So, moving on. Here's an example of a castle that people usually think about. Not very scaled. Here is a map of a traditional castle. You can see the various items that it would have. You got your moat, and you guys remember the video what was in the moat. You have the keep, which is where the lord usually stayed. You had your water supply, and so on. Very well defended, very organized. So, that leads us to the feudal system. And what is the feudal system? Well, castles were self-sufficient. Economic activity occurred in and around the castle. There was no trade, no one going to different places to get items. Everything was done around the castle. Okay? This meant that little to no trade occurred during this time period. There was hardly any trade. Everything was all about the castle. Very simple. Most of the peasants during the Middle Ages were serfs. Serfs were given land to farm in exchange for service to their lord. Okay, now the difference between a serf and a peasant is a serf was tied to the land, and I'll go into that a little bit later. Peasants could leave and go as they pleased, but serfs could not. And wasn't exactly the best of lives for them, but they did function. Just trying to see if this works or not. All right. Service included working in the fields, maintaining roads, and the castle or military during wars. There was a lot to do during this time period, and they did it around the castle. Everything. The lords also had responsibilities under the system. They provided land, they protected the people, and the people in turn were loyal to the king. Okay? Excuse me again. Feudalism affected all levels of society. And just a side note, I am just going to record. I'm not going to go edit and do things like that. I'm trying to get this to be as free-flowing as it would be, as if we were actually in class. I thought about naming students who usually don't listen or pay attention, but I decided, you guys know who you are. And for those of you who do pay attention and listen, you got my big thumbs up. You see my thumb come up here. There it goes, right there, thumbs up. So, all good. Lastly, feudalism affected all levels of society. At least in Europe. Other parts of the world, they had different systems. But in Europe, this is how it worked. Let us move on. Which leads us a question. We're not going to have the normal pair off with your partners, unless you would like to do that at home and talk to a sibling or a parent or someone about these very things. You're more than welcome to do so. It might enhance what you're doing, but obviously not everyone can do that, so I'm not going to make it a requirement. But if we were in class, you know you'd be doing it. Could there have been a better way to live other than feudalism? We actually answered this question before. Can you think of a better system? And we have said that the United States is one of the systems that seems to have worked. The superior system in that people have rights, not given by a government, but given by, as it says in the Declaration of Independence, their creators. So, excuse me, I haven't talked in a while. Go ahead and talk to your partner, come up with one other form of government, prepare to share. Obviously, that is up to you now. If you were in class, you would definitely be doing that. Let us move on. And for some of you might remember this chart. You should have it in your notes. If you don't, you need to copy it down. This lays out the various stages and levels in feudalism. Obviously, the king's at the top, ruler of all lands. Then you have the lords, the church leaders, and nobles. They owned land and had much power and wealth, still under the king. And then you had the knights, the warriors, provided military service to nobles in return for the land. Began training at a young age. So we're learning this stuff right when everything started to happen. Peasants and serfs worked the land for nobles in exchange for living and eating food from the land. And obviously I did a few voice impressions because we're learning about Europe. That'll happen from time to time. It is something I enjoy doing, and I know you guys enjoy the various voices that I use. So don't want these things to be too boring. So there you go. So make sure you have this chart. Obviously you can pause so you can write all this down. But we move on. So here's what feudalism looked like. You had your king at the top, your noble, your vassals, and your peasants at the very bottom. So, nice silly diagram to illustrate what you guys are learning. All right. And how did this compare to what life was like in Japan? And I remember sharing with you that Japan developed the exact same way of living. Japan had an emperor. Europe had a king or a lord, a lesser lord. Emperor, shogun, daimyo. The warriors had the knights. Japan had the samurai. The code was chivalry. And for the Japanese, it was bushido. Both practices developed in response to the need for security. So this came about because there was no rulers protecting people. Roman Empire had fallen. They had to have a system to protect themselves. Okay? So, everyone had well-defined social roles. This helped preserve law and order because everybody knew what was required of them. There was no misunderstandings. There was no curiosity about it. It was like, this is your role. This is what you do. That is it. All right. We're just moving along. The age of Charlemagne, or as I said in class, Charlemagne, as a lot of students sometimes say. We were just about here when everything happened, so I'm going to show this, and then I'm going to, in part 2 of the video, begin where we left off and move on from there. Kind of break it up. The video is already about 11:40, so I don't want them to be too long. But let's talk about Charlemagne. And obviously had a nice beard. 800 AD, Western Europe was briefly unified under one gentleman from France. He was a Frank. A Christian pope proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans, reviving the idea of a united Christian world. We talked about this idea that Christianity was the official religion of the Roman Empire before it fell. And now it is becoming more evident in society. Everybody predominantly was a Christian at this time. Very different from a secular society. But this increased the split between Eastern and Western Christianity. We're learning about this. The Eastern Orthodox versus the Catholics. That was the only form of Christianity there was at this time. There were people who practiced that belief system, but it was done in such a way that either there were small groups, but the biggest group was Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, hence Roman Empire, Roman Catholicism. So what is the difference? And I remember in class I had read the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, and the Athanasians' Creed to represent the different beliefs. And I might do that on part 2 of the video. Obviously I'd have to pull it up, but I'll have it on the screen. Make it a little bit easier what we're talking about. So, during the Middle Ages, 2 distinct Christian groups emerged, Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. And here you have some of the symbolism with the Roman Catholic belief. Alpha and Omega, keys to heaven and hell, the Holy Grail, 10 Commandments, Holy Spirit represented with a dove. This is what historic Christianity believes. Eastern Orthodox, more of a monastic way of looking at things, very different than Catholicism. Go ahead and look at that for a moment. Alright, what are the differences? Well, the Pope has final say in Catholicism. Church competes with political for control. Even today, with everything going on, there seems to be a kind of push and pull with the Catholics in various parts of the world and what's happening. So there's always that tension between Catholicism and government. You have a celibate priesthood, meaning that the priests forsake marriage in devotion to God. And for communion, they use unleavened bread, which is bread made without yeast. Okay? The flip side, church councils decide what happens in Eastern Christianity. Church accepts political control. Whatever the government does, they're okay with that. If they disagree, they will voice their opposition, but for the most part, they agree. Priests can marry. There's no prohibition against marrying, so they do. And they have regular bread or bread with yeast, which is called leavened. It's an old term that people use. All right. So what was the role of the church? And those of you getting to this point in the video are like, oh yeah, I remember this. You should. If you don't, that's why I'm doing this. So spiritual role. Religion was a central part of life for medieval people from baptism to marriage. Okay? Secular, meaning non-religious. In addition to being the social center of the village, the church had economic power and political power. Okay? Church was the largest landholder, gained wealth through tithing, that is giving of your earnings, had its own laws and courts, which frequently clashed with the king's authority. Some parish priests even ran schools. So we were learning about this right before school was ending. And here's a map of Charlemagne's empire. You can see just how much of the old Roman Empire it had taken up. Okay? You can also see how the Umayyad Empire from the Islamic groups had control of almost all of Spain. 700 years they were in control. Some historians debate if it was 800, 700, 900. We'll take 7. Feudalism, political, economic, social system based on loyalty and military service. Should have already written this down. Obviously you have time now. Go ahead. And that brings us to the power of the Roman Catholic Church. Again, why was the church so powerful? The church and kings needed this power to govern people's lives. It's a little difficult to have authority over people when you can't rewind that. It's hard to govern people when you don't have the authority to govern people. And right now you're witnessing this with everything that's going on with our state government, with our federal government. They're instituting mandates. You have to stay at your home, so on. They have been given power by the people. We've elected them. And because of that, they exercise that power. Well, in Europe, during feudalism, same thing, except they had kings, they had religious leaders, and so on. And therein lies the difference. This is more a way of governing by king and edict versus representation from people voting for people, and they represent us. If we don't like what they're doing, we can vote them out. Very different. Can't vote a king out unless you're watching Star Wars and you elect a king or queen from Naboo. But anyway. Roman Catholic Church also needed a strong organization to serve people well. It's kind of hard to serve people. As we're learning right now, the more organized things are, the easier it is to serve them. If it's disorganized, it's more difficult. Thus, the Roman Catholic Church had a well-defined organizational system. We learned that. Okay. The church saved education from completely disappearing after the fall of Rome. As you can see, they were able to preserve education by studying the works of the Greeks, studying the works of the Romans, different lessons from antiquity. They kept it going. Okay. So, what was the organization of the church? Well, the Pope was at the top, spiritual and political leader of the church. Cardinals helped the Pope run the church. They're the next level. They are the ones that are usually in red, hence cardinals. Bishops ran the diocese or areas where churches are grouped. So there's the LA Archdiocese, there's the Orange County Diocese. They're just big organizations. Priests ran individual churches and gave the sacraments, communion, marriage, baptism. We'll go into that later. Monks and nuns lived isolated in monasteries, and they're the ones that preserved. They're the ones that completely separated themselves from society and gave of themselves to God in their beliefs, sacrificing everything for Him. All right. And this is where we were going to jump in, so I'm going to pause right here. Ooh, 20 minutes, perfect. And then in part 2, I will begin from here, and this is the stuff that I have not taught you yet. So this should be both interesting and fun. So, your job is to have taken notes on this. Make sure you followed all the things you're supposed to do. And in the next video, we will tackle manorialism and end the feudalistic part of our learning. There might be another video coming up after this too, different. I have to see. So, again, Mr. Martinez, thank you for watching. Enjoy. Again, watch this as many times as you want. And learn. Read the textbook. Do the workbook. And as always, if you have any questions, email me through School Loop or the email I gave you. And just do your best. It's a very difficult time. We all know that. Do your best. Thank you, Mr. Martinez. Out.